Okay, so we're on page 353, and we have been introduced to the relationship between the Mathers and Cotton Mather and Benjamin Franklin. Now, before I start, let's just consider that context a minute. The Mathers are famous Puritans. Benjamin Franklin is not a famous Puritan. In fact, Benjamin Franklin seems to be more of a secular deist type, a deist meaning the idea that there's a God, but God doesn't interact with us. He just created everything, and now he's watching it unfold without taking a hand in human experience, in human events. So that's a general impression that I think most of us have, and we got it from school. And Benjamin Franklin is a scientist. Come on now, he's not a holy roller. So my question is, how can we accept the idea that our author is putting forth that Benjamin Franklin was in fact mentored by Cotton Mather? The battle for science. It was nothing less than an issue of life or death, which became the battleground between Cotton Mather and the oligarchical forces opposing him. The same struggle brought Benjamin Franklin into active political life for the first time, though in a manner which historians typically have blatantly distorted or obscured. Late in the spring of 1721, an epidemic of the dreaded smallpox, which had blasted New England's hopes at so many critical times in the past, erupted again in Boston. As a member of Britain's Royal Society, Cotton Mather had read some of its reports in 1719 on experimental attempts at vaccination undertaken in the Levant in the Middle East, and had independently investigated similar reports from the Caribbean. He was convinced that small doses drawn from the infected tissue of a smallpox victim could be administered to inoculate others against the disease. Mather launched a campaign through his civic organizations to persuade citizens to come forward and be vaccinated. Yeah, interesting. The first, is that resonant today or what? As administering physician, Mather enlisted Dr. Zabdiel Boylston, Boylston, parentheses, whose brother would become the great grandfather of President John Adams. While certainly there were doubts about this new remedy proposed, Mather's opponents responded in frenzied rage against the prospect of his becoming the scientist savior of Boston. John Checkley and William Douglas had drawn James Franklin, the restless printer, still in search of steady business, deeper into their circle. They now chose him as the leading instrument for their propaganda barrage against the Mathers. With their backing, James Franklin agreed to start a new paper in Boston, the weekly New England Courant, to compete with the Boston Gazette and Boston Newsletter. The smallpox epidemic spread rapidly during the summer of 1721, lasting through to the following spring, and ultimately striking half the population of Boston. Cotton Mather announced the inoculation campaign in a letter to the Boston Gazette of July 27, 1721, also signed by Increase Mather and four leading ministers. Simultaneously, the Courant made its first appearance. For its third issue, John Checkley wrote that it was, quote, the chief design of which paper to oppose the doubtful and dangerous practice of inoculating the smallpox. Cotton Mather was accused of spreading the disease by inoculation. Is that resonant or what? On August 15th, he inoculated his own son, Samuel, who lived in good health until 1785 at the ripe old age of 79. On November 1st, he brought his nephew, Thomas Walter, from nearby Roxbury for an inoculation and was then accused of bringing outsiders into town to infect them. On November 4th, the Boston town meeting, dominated by Elisha Cook Jr.'s Satanic Party, voted to prohibit anyone from entering Boston to be vaccinated and extended the ban to anyone already inoculated. On November 13th, while Thomas Walter lay asleep in Cotton Mather's bedroom, overcoming the mild effects of his vaccination, a bomb was thrown through the window at 3 a.m. The iron grenade struck the window casement, which fortunately knocked off the fuse, preventing the explosion. Tied to the bomb by a string, quote, that it might outlive the breaking of the shell, unquote, Mather noted was a message, quote, Cotton Mather, you dog, damn you. I'll inoculate you with this, with a pox to you, unquote. Within the Franklin household, the repercussions of this attempt to assassinate Cotton Mather must have been severe. Franklin's autobiography is no help. The portion of it covering his life up to 1730 was written in 1771 as a letter to his son William when Franklin was still in England as the official diplomatic representative of Massachusetts. Pardon me a second. I just have to emphasize how amazingly coincidental this text is. He's talking about events in the spring and summer of 1721, exactly 300 years ago, and debating the same arguments that we debate today. It's fascinating. William Franklin, educated as a lawyer at the Inns of Court in London while living with his father, became royal governor of New Jersey and sided with the crown during the American Revolution. William fled to England, and Franklin's account of his own early years in Boston passed through many enemy hands. On issues of obvious political significance, it must be read with an eye as to what is missing, and with extensive cross-checking of other sources for clues. The precise moment of Benjamin Franklin's recruitment by the Mathers is not so far documentable. He was only 15 when his brother James began publishing The Current, though by several accounts the Mathers took Benjamin aside to discuss his brother's actions with him. How much sway Josiah Franklin still held over the renegade James is also unclear, but the issue of The Current immediately followed the attempted bombing of Cotton Mather's house. The issue of The Current immediately following the attempted bombing carried Mather's account of the incident verbatim, quote, to prevent wrong representations that may be made of a late occurrence much talked of, unquote. Governor Shute, also a political target of the Cook machine, offered a hefty 50-pound reward for identification of the terrorist. But the genocidal campaign against inoculation continued. I don't get the use of the word genocidal here, but and again, I apologize because I haven't read this text before. So all of this is as new to me as it is to you. We're over 300 pages into the book, and I had not read the whole book. So anyway, it's kind of eye-opening, is it not? Hmm. The genocidal campaign against inoculation continued. The ethical equivalent of Britain's Hellfire Club appeared in Boston. with John Checkley as president, as, quote, the Society of Physicians Anti-Inoculator, unquote, meeting at Hall's Tavern, where its members took oaths to destroy Mather. To the Cook-controlled Boston selectmen, William Douglas submitted a translation, purportedly of a French army doctor's claims that persons inoculated in the Near East during the previous century had died 20 and 25 years later of ulcers and tumors. With the aid of Cook's henchmen and a strident campaign of public lying in the pages of the New England Courant, Checkley and his friends were rapidly creating an anti-science mob in Massachusetts. Like the anti-science environmentalist cults of today, deployed to smash the remaining vestiges of the American system's commitment to technological progress, the, quote, anti-inoculators had no interest in the scientific validity of the vaccine Mather and Boylston developed. Although the epidemic was well underway when Dr. Boylston began administering smallpox vaccinations. Of the 286 persons he inoculated, only 6 died, barely more than 2%. The death rate among the rest of Boston's smallpox victims was approximately 700% higher, with 844 fatalities out of 5,759 cases. Smallpox epidemics in Britain during this period were similarly devastating, but no one tried to assassinate Dr. Boylston when he inoculated the royal princesses or on a mission to London to demonstrate the efficacy of the new vaccine. There is no precise count of how many Bostonians died needlessly because they refused inoculation under the sway of Checkley's vicious campaign. But there is no doubt that it took a heavy toll on that will to do good necessary to a people's survival. To Increase and Cotton Mather, the two remaining giants of the Puritan Republic, it appeared that the dominion of Satan was at hand. In January 1722, as James Franklin's Courant continued its efforts to prevent inoculations, one of its scribblers went so far as to write, quote, most of the ministers are for it, and that induces me to think it is from the devil, for he often makes use of good men as instruments to obtrude his delusions on the world, unquote. Such blasphemy, such open celebrations of evil did not go unanswered, and Benjamin Franklin was inevitably an intimate witness. Despite years of incapacitating illness, Increase Mather, now over 82 years old, rose from his bed to charge James Franklin on a public street with fostering, quote, a hellfire club. Increase Mather was a living link to the Republican Commonwealth founded by John Winthrop as the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Born in 1639, Mather was educated at Harvard and then at Trinity College, Dublin, where the Mathers family relations remained intellectually influential into the lifetime of Jonathan Swift. After serving in England as an intelligence agent of the Republican cause, until the Stuart Restoration of 1660, Mather returned to Massachusetts and an extraordinary career as minister, scientist, philosopher, and statesman. He earned the mantle of leadership in New England, succeeding the great John Winthrop Jr. after the latter's death in 1676. This second Winthrop, who molded the Connecticut colony into a broadened Republican flank for Massachusetts, whose library in the wilderness abounded with the works of Machiavelli, Erasmus, Thomas More, Johannes Kepler, Jean Baudin, and Blaise Pascal, and who corresponded with the young Leibniz in Germany, was one of those New England heroes, quote, worthy to have their lives written as copies for future ages to write after, as Cotton Mather put it. In 1675, John Winthrop Jr. exemplified his political and military leadership by stopping an invasion of Connecticut by royal forces before they could even come ashore. King Charles II's attempt to subjugate Connecticut was led by Sir Edmund Andros, the man later overthrown and clapped in irons during Massachusetts' rebellion of 1689, engineered by Winthrop's key collaborator of the 1670s, Increase Mather. How amazingly resonant it is for me to be reading this about John Winthrop Jr., whose property became Loomis School, the very property of the beginning of this Republican self-governing Connecticut, based upon the principles of republicanism, has been converted into an institution and a tradition that is closed, a closed society that only really wants its own. And from time to time may think it needs new blood, and so will recruit someone, like, say, a Thomas F. O'Loughlin, and try to mold them into one of them, and to mold that person's personality so that he becomes a willing servant of this closed society that rules by secrecy behind the curtain. And that's why my father's life is so important, is to say, he lived as a free, sovereign person in order to preserve the rights of everyone else to live as a free, sovereign person. And that he found himself in a position so high in our government that he was able to actually strike back at them with a secret military mission to catch those goddamn traitors that are doing dope deals and infecting our country with heroin. And so when we read these events about the heroes of the Puritan era, it's hard for me to identify with a Winthrop as a hero when that tradition has brought so much sadness and destruction to my family. I'll say another thing. My grandfather, Tom Sr., he loved Connecticut. He loved Hartford. He loved every ethnic group, he loved the Italians, he loved the Chinese, he loved the Germans and the Dutch. And he was very, very uh, gregarious. As a matter of fact, he was actually the state president of the Elks. And I've got a bunch of pictures and things I'll show you someday. My sister has this incredibly big jeweled pendant, or whatever that is, that they use to symbolize the people that are the leaders in things like the Elks and all, with all the jewels. Well, anyway, she's got this. I don't think it's real, but it's of some value, but it's gorgeous. But the point is, my grandfather was a gregarious enough person to have risen in the Elks, thousands of people in the state of Connecticut. And so he wasn't restrictive as to who he would associate with, and I don't think that 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 type of that somehow his patriotism was innate and sincere. Someday I'll show you I have a what's called a first day cover. If you ever done any stamp collecting, which I did when I was young, he had actually gotten a first day cover of the anniversary of Yorktown, not Yorktown, Saratoga, the Battle of Saratoga, and there's it's a beautiful red postage stamp with a picture of Rochambeau, Washington, and I think maybe DeGrasse or something. And anyway, I'm getting the history wrong, but the point is that he actually got that uh, first day cover addressed to him, and I've got that. He also was a big fan of Nathan Hale, and there's a statue of Nathan Hale. It's high on a prominent place there as you go along the highway along near New Haven. And when we would go by it, he would say, that's Nathan Hale, and he'd ask us, what did Nathan Hale say? He said, my only regret is that I have but one life to give for my country. Whatever freedom Massachusetts retained by 1722, much of it was due to wariness on London's part after the Andros Rebellion and to the liberties preserved even under royal government by the new charter secured by Increase Mather. Despite the delay, sorry, despite the decay which spread through Massachusetts by the time of the smallpox fight, it was no small matter for James Franklin to be publicly threatened with the wrath of God by the elder statesmen of this Puritan republic. Quote, I think I have known what New England was from the beginning, cannot be but troubled to see the degeneracy of this place, Mather declared. I cannot but pity poor James Franklin, who, though but a young man, it may be speedily he must appear before the judgment seat of God. And what answer will he give for printing things so vile and abominable? Mather's rage focused on the current insinuation that, quote, if the ministers of God approve of a thing, it is a sign of the devil, which is a horrid thing to be related. In the midst of this situation, imagine 16-year-old Benjamin Franklin, whose father witnessed the Andros Rebellion and became a respected citizen leader in Cotton Mather's drive against the cultural decline which was threatening to extinguish New England's Republican aspirations. Yet, according to standard historical accounts, Benjamin Franklin had no role in the most dramatic political battle Massachusetts had seen during his life, except that of a juvenile prankster eager to have fun at the expense of those crotchety old Mathers. But nations are not created that way, and their founders invariably demonstrate something more than a flair for juvenile delinquency. The deteriorating situation confronting Cotton Mather and his fellow Republicans certainly permitted no frontal assaults and demanded the most skillful flanking maneuvers. Royal license for the bestial ethics of a Bernard Mandeville. You remember him? He's the guy um, the hell that started the Hellfire Clubs. Had provided sufficient footing to deploy an irrationalist mob in Massachusetts, far enough to lend cover to an open attempt on Mather's life. His supportive circle of Republican allies and friends, led by key colonial governors, had also been broken. Robert Hunter, a friend in common to Swift and Mather, had left the governorship of New York in 1719, Governor Shute of Massachusetts was under pressure from both London and from Cook's Satanic Party. Governor Spotswood of Virginia was removed from office in 1722 while negotiating the treaty with the Iroquois that opened the way for westward expansion. Internationally, the situation was also deteriorating. Remaining nation-building factions in both Britain and France had been flattened, along with numbers of Americans' Republicans' allies, including in the economic crash of 1720 when the Venetian-rigged speculative schemes known as the South Sea Bubble in Britain and John Law's Mississippi Bubble in France were blown out. The simultaneous efforts to ruin both the British and French economies drew considerable attention from Cotton Mather, who knew better than most the evil that was not localized in one country or under one label. At the time of the attempt on his life in November 1721, Mather was just completing works on both cases, quote, The Roaring of the South Sea, on the collapse of the British bubble, and a book in French, Un grand voix du ciel à la France, sous la verge de Dieu. A great voice from heaven to France under the scourge of God. And I apologize for my French. Mather's diary notes that he sought to offer seasonable reflections and profitable instructions for the unhappy nation of Britain and urged the French to come out of Babylon. He had consulted with Governor Shute on how to get my Grande Voix du Ciel into France, anticipating that if he could secure distribution of the book inside the country, then reeling under the Orleans Venetian Jesuit, the country then reeling under the Orleans Venetian Jesuit rampage, quote, very astonishing may be the consequences of it. At the same time, Mather was writing letters for Europe, where a series of smallpox epidemics was making terrible destruction, to circulate a further, quote, more distinct account of the smallpox inoculated, the method and success of it among us, and the opposition to it. Cotton Mather's situation in Massachusetts, as underscored by the New England Courant's hate campaign against his effort to stop the smallpox epidemic, was more immediately distressing. For all the well-meaning people he had inclined to do good, he as yet had no one willing to lead a fight at the level of command required. After the Courant flaunted its claim at the beginning of January 1722 that the Mather's support for inoculation meant it must be the work of the devil, Cotton put the problem before, quote, a meeting of the ministers on January 15th. Citing his hopes in writing essays to do good, Mather told his colleagues, my opportunities to do good, which have been to me the apple of my eye, have been strangely struck at. Odd occurrences have happened which have produced unaccountable combinations in all ranks of men to disable me for doing what I have been most inclined to do. The most false representations imaginable have been made of me and of my conduct. And though I could easily have confuted the slanders and clamors, I have rather borne them with silence. I am at length reduced unto this condition that my opportunities to do good appear to me almost entirely extinguished as to this country. I must employ my faculties in projections to do good in more distant places, and I bless God I have there a prospect of some things whereof I shall know more hereafter. But at present I have done treating you with any more of my proposals. If they should be never so good, yet if they be known to be mine, that is enough to bespeak a blast upon them. Do you propose as many good things as you please, and I will second them, and assist them, and fall in with them to the best of my capacity. Well, isn't that an interesting comment? Here's somebody who got to the end of his rope. And I think that happens. We get burned out trying to get the message out. And at a certain point, um, Cotton Mather here got overwhelmed, and he said, there's no point in fighting back because if I print something, they'll print 1,000 things. Um, is that not the case with our media today? Besides Mather's forceful challenge to his associates, for whom he had served as intellectual leader and political commander in chief for more than 30 years, the interesting feature of this address is his reference to remaining opportunities to do good. Just 2 weeks earlier, in his diary, Mather reported that he was privately forming a new society, quote, for some of my flock who desired to, quote, be more fully acquainted with the mysteries of the kingdom of God, wherein his will shall be done on earth as it is in heaven, unquote. He hoped that the society may afford me more opportunities to do good for the flock, some further considerable services. The Silence Do Good papers. The legend constructed of Benjamin Franklin's alleged mischief against the Mathers during the smallpox fight centers around his anonymous submission of a series of letters to the New England Current under the pseudonym Silence Do Good. His authorship was not initially detected, even by his brother James, the editor of the Current, since the Current's primary target was Cotton Mather, widely known as the author of Essays to Do Good. It was first assumed in some quarters and later retailed as historical fact that Silence Do Good was an opponent of the Mathers and perhaps even a menacing one. The actual evidence exposes a long list of fools and liars. Benjamin Franklin's debut as a political polemicist was a flanking and encirclement operation against the enemies of Cotton Mather and led directly to Franklin's being developed into the trusted agent of leading Massachusetts Republicans for nearly 70 years. The design of the trap Franklin helped to set for Checkley's anti-inoculator cult was an able variation on Jonathan Swift's Bickerstaff papers, which Cotton Mather had copied so extensively into his diary in 1708. Both of Mather's still considerable stature and the civic reputation of the Franklin family, intermarried with relations of the Mathers, left James Franklin vulnerable to pressure. Such had been the case following the November 1721 attempt to assassinate Cotton Mather, when the Current not only printed his account of the bombing attack, but ran as the lead some decidedly Matherin verses on the smallpox epidemic. They were written at the time of the outbreak in May by one Matthew Adams, who in November gave them to James Franklin to publish, and ascribed the sickly gloom of the infectious clouds to an angry God irked by a, quote, black and awful list of all our crimes. Among the handful of intellectual influences Benjamin Franklin cites respecting his youth in Boston is this same Matthew Adams, quote, an ingenious, sensible man who had a pretty collection of books and who frequented our printing house, took notice of me, invited me to see his library, and very kindly proposed to lend me such books as I chose to read. In February 1722, following Cotton Mather's report to the ministers that his attempts to do good in his own name could no longer succeed, Matthew Adams again managed to have a contribution published. This time, Adams lifted a paragraph verbatim, ascribing it only as something I had somewhere read from Jonathan Swift's A Tale of a Tub, published in 1694. It was Swift's first scathing attack on modern perversions of religion and on Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, the, quote, spiritual professor of Bernard Mandeville's celebration of sodomic horror, quote, the fable of the bees, unquote. Adams's quoting of A Tale of a Tub without naming the work suggests more about the delicate counter-operation Cotton Mather was preparing against the Current. Swift himself never publicly acknowledged authorship of the book that nonetheless brought him so much public attention, even Swift's Gulliver's Travels, 1726. an allegorical attack on the insanity of the oligarchy in general and the rotten Whig ministry of Sir Robert Walpole in particular was published anonymously. Those freedom loving Whig governments which dominated the reign of King George I and his Hanoverian successors repeatedly sought to convict Swift as author of anything offending them, ordered the arrest and trial of his printers, or suppressed publication entirely. During the week following Matthew Adams' piece in The Current, Mather noted in his diary that he had written several things, quote, toward suppressing and rebuking those wicked pamphlets that are continually published amongst us to lessen and blacken the ministers and poison the people. Though my poor hand is the doer of them, they must pass through other hands, that I may not pass for the author of them. Ironically, one of Benjamin Franklin's later agents in Ireland had to flee to the United States to escape arrest for reprinting Swift's A Modest Proposal half a century after Swift's death. The agent was Matthew Carey, Republican and economist in his own right and the father of Henry Carey, the leading developer of American system economics during the period of Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln. Matthew Carey's crime against the government of George III was to make available again Swift's devastating indictment of British genocide against Ireland, in which he anonymously offered a scheme for breeding babies for human consumption as a solution for Ireland's poverty and misery. Well, reading this morning has really kind of stirred a lot of stuff inside of me. You know, my father's side of the family, they love New England, and the whole the whole Irishness of my father's family was obscured. The only thing Irish about them was their name and a sense of humor. I mean, my grandfather was really, really a funny guy, and my dad was he hardly ever said anything that was intended to be humorous, but when he did, when he saw something like, you know, he liked Laurel and Hardy, and of course you couldn't just watch him whenever you wanted to like you can now. It would be rarely, but you know, we had Channel 5 in Washington D.C., WTTG, and they occasionally would play Laurel and Hardy on a Saturday, and I can remember him sitting there watching it and his belly just shaking, and he was just when he started to laugh, he would just it was like the beginning of a volcano that was going to erupt, and it just started shaking and shaking, and then suddenly he would just erupt in laughter. Let's leave it there for this morning. I think of my dad and his wonderful sense of humor. He enjoyed life, and we should do the same. Have a good day, and don't forget to tune in to see George Webb at noon with Neighborhood News Hour. I'm not sure the name of their new channel. You know, they had 3 channels struck last night, and that means they are over the target. Boy, they are over the target. So be sure and follow George as he reveals more and more of his amazing investigation and research.